Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll give things just one more minute for folks to come in from other meetings. Excited to get things kicked off for this important discussion. All right, looks like we've got a good number of folks in, and we're about a minute after the hour, so let's go ahead and get things started. Hi, thank you. Welcome to Digital Accessibility and the EAA, Ensuring Compliance by June 28th. My name is Brooke Horn. I'm Operations Manager for the Book Industry Study Group. The Book Industry Study Group is the trade association for the book industry, connecting all of our various segments. We operate a working group on accessibility metadata, where our mission is to educate and amplify the good work of other organizations to just help prepare our industry for that compliance. I'm here today with Gregorio, Allison, and Rick, who will be speaking on this topic. We will be doing a few minutes of presentations from each of our panelists to start off with, followed by a robust section for discussion and then Q&A. So please definitely go ahead and start dropping those questions into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can before the end of the session. It is recorded, so if you do have to drop off for any reason, all of our registrants will get a recording of that webinar. And if we can't get to all of the questions in that Q&A, we'll do our best to try and answer those after the fact and get those out to folks as well. So without any further ado, I would love to turn to Gregorio. Gregorio, if you'd introduce yourself a little bit, and let's get started.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke, and hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm in Italy. My name is Gregorio Pellegrino, and I work as Chief Accessibility Officer at Fondazione Lia in Italy. As you may see from my Latin lover headshot photo, I'm an Italian software engineer. I was born in a publishing house, literally, because my parents funded a small publishing house in 1995. And I grew up mixing information technology and knowledge on how to make books. I'm serving as a co-editor for important documents related to digital publishing and accessibility, like the World Wide Web Consortium EPUB Accessibility 1.1, the EPUB Accessibility EU Accessibility Act mapping, and the guidelines to display accessibility metadata. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that I'm the technical lead in a small expert group that is working with Adobe to improve the accessibility of EPUBs exported by InDesign. And in the last year, we've achieved a lot of improvements. Before we dive deeper, I must emphasize that while I work on accessibility standards, I'm not a lawyer, so this presentation is intended for strictly awareness purposes and not as a legal advice. As I mentioned, I work for Fondazione Lia, that is a non-for-profit foundation created 11 years ago through the collaboration between the Italian Publisher Association and the Italian Blind Union. Our foundation works with 86 publishing houses worldwide to help companies to be more accessible. We are an active part of many key organizations in the sector, working with standards bodies like the World Wide Web Consortium, the DAISY Consortium, the EDR Lab, while maintaining strong connections through the publishing ecosystem. And this is an important part of my daily work. Since 2011, when Lia started as a research and development project, we have pioneered the implementation of the Born Accessible principles, creating and maintaining a catalog of over 40,000 accessible ebooks distributed through the traditional commercial channels. So we were in line with the European Accessibility Act far before the Act came in place. But let's focus on the European Accessibility Act, the so-called EAA. The aim of the EAA, the idea behind the EAA is to enhance the European market for products and services by introducing specific accessibility requirements. And it applies to many products and services like devices, home banking, self-service terminals, as well as ebooks, reading devices, and all the related e-commerce services. The critical date to remember is June the 28th, 2025, so this year. And from this date, the directive will be applied to every service and product made available on the European market. We have developed, a small checklist to double check if you are compliant with the EAA. Are your ebooks accessible? Are you producing and displaying accessibility metadata for your ebooks? Is your interface of your e-commerce or app accessible? Does your reading solution provide features for accessible reading? So don't worry if you answer no to some of these questions, because we have well-established accessibility standards for each of these aspects. You can see those in these slides, and maybe we can dig a little bit deeper during the session after the presentation. But how can you become an accessible company? It's important to mention that it's not only like let's say it's not a switch that you press and you are accessible. It's an ongoing process. What is relevant is the paradigm shift from the traditional approach to the born accessible philosophy. In the traditional model, different formats were created for different needs: braille books, large print, audiobooks, each requiring separate production processes with related time and cost constraints. So the catalog of accessible books was limited. In the digital world, a single accessible digital publication that follows the accessibility standards can serve many users through different reading modalities, braille displays, and large characters, text-to-speech, all from the same source file. So what is the EAA about? It's not only about making requirements for single products and services. It's about creating an accessible digital ecosystem that connects all elements, from the publications and metadata to the distribution platforms, online bookshops, digital libraries, payment systems, and reading devices. Each component must be accessible for the entire chain to work. In Fondazione Elia, we have developed a comprehensive system to help every actor of the supply chain to embrace the accessibility, from consulting to workflow analysis, image descriptions, training, accessibility metadata production, quality control for publications, auditing for digital platforms, certification, and to support the corporate accessibility statements. But I think we will come later on all these different aspects of making digital publication accessible. So for the moment, I will leave the floor to Brooke again, so to have the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gregorio. Now I'd like to turn to Allison.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Allison Beelan, and I'm with Duke University Press, where I serve as the Director for Strategic Innovation and Services. Among other things, that often finds me coordinating efforts that involve many parts of the press and involve coordinating across all of our functional areas, which the EAA has definitely brought into play for us. So I will adopt Gregorio's bit and just say I am not a lawyer, nor am I an expert in this, nor would I ever want to say that Duke University Press has, found the one right way. I know a lot of our university press colleagues are on here, and I think that as a community, We've been sharing information, swapping information, and each finding sort of using each other in the community to find our way. So today I'm just going to try to talk about sort of how we've approached it as a publisher of scholarly books. So just to orient you, we publish about 140 books a year and have a 4,000 book, roughly, ebook backlist. And I mentioned that we also publish a significant number of scholarly journals. Because this is focused on books today, but we have gone ahead and used compliance with the EAA for ebooks as an opportunity to bring our scholarly journals into accessibility compliance also. Our subject areas are the humanities, social science, and mathematics, and within those, we happen to publish a lot of very image-heavy books in the arts. So we are looking at quite a volume of imagery when we're looking at this. And mathematics is primarily on our journal side, but in some of our books also. So that brings into play MathML. In terms of ebooks, we offer sort of 3 different ebook products, or we produce 3 different ebook products. One are EPUB-based ebooks out to the retail market. Then there are PDF ebooks that largely we distribute to library resellers, library vendors, and they sell access to those titles to institutions of higher education. And then we also sell our own digital ebook collection directly to the library market. And for that, we produce PDFs with XML metadata and host it on our own website. So that means that when we're thinking about who's reading these books, who's buying them, we've got individual consumers. We are selling to library vendors who then wrap our ebooks in their services. We are also selling direct to libraries, and we're selling to booksellers. So as we looked at how are we going to produce our books so that they are accessible, here's the landscape we are working with. Including administrative functions, we have about 50 people supporting our book publishing. We do project management of book production in-house. So we have a set of project editors who work in-house. We generally use freelancers for copy editing and proofreading, and we outsource our composition, XML tagging, and EPUB creation to a set of vendors. So as we tackled the EAA, just for our own internal reference, we broke it down into kind of 3 major components that we decided to call editorial accessibility. And that was a way of saying, like, these are the things in the scholarship itself that need to be acted on during the authoring or editing process. So that would be the alt text creation and encoding, language tagging, making sure the images will display well. And then there was what we called technical accessibility, which was really about the format, the technology being used to display the scholarship. And then finally, the third component being accessibility discovery. Where are all the places that we need to tell the world about the accessibility levels and affordances of each of our books, as well as our general practices. So, I mentioned that we have all these different products and different formats that we make our ebooks available. We did choose to focus entirely for now on EPUB, our EPUB formats. So at this moment, we are not doing anything to go back and make at the moment, to embed into our PDF creation process necessarily anything more accessible than it is right now, other than there's no reason that our images that have alt text, they will also have alt text in the PDFs that get created. But we're focusing on making EPUB 3 available in all of those market channels. So I think one of the first things all of us had to do once we got our hands around what the EAA's requirements were is figure out how, who's going to do what. And this is how we have broken up the division of responsibility. So we did decide to ask our authors from the get-go to submit with their manuscripts alt text for all of their images. And if we anticipated that we would have instances of non-compliance, we had no idea how much we might see. Thankfully, we've seen a really high level of compliance from our book authors once we put the requirement in place. But just in case, we made provisions for vendors to create alt text if it was not delivered. And when we started off, we did not ask the authors to do anything around around language shift identification and tagging, but we are reconsidering that and figuring out what might be reasonable to ask authors to do in their manuscript, because that's the area that has really proven to be quite labor intensive. So for our in-house project editors, their work is to prepare the materials that we get from the authors and get them out to the freelancers and vendors, along with guidance about what we want them to do in terms of accessibility work, and then of course performing quality assurance on that. So our freelance copy editors, we ask them to review the alt text. We don't expect them to heavily copy edit it, but if they see something that deviates from our house style in this area, they can flag it. And we right now we are asking them to mark up language in the manuscript files. And then we have asked our vendors to take those manuscript files and hopefully that have all that information embedded in them and encode it. For our vendors who are capable of it, to create it if it hasn't been done. So if there is an author who is not able to provide alt text or miss some images, instead of spending our time going and trying to get that from the author, once production has started, we will have the vendors supply it and then have the authors able to review it at proofs stage. So once we sort of had that mapped out, what did we have to do to get this flowing? So it was a lot of updating of documents. It basically entailed us touching every set of guidelines and style documentation we had. We published new author guidelines, collaborated heavily with our acquisition editors on that, getting those into the new guidelines into their hands. We updated our freelancer instructions and guidelines, including extending sort of high-level instruction into the art of creating good alt text. We revised our house style guide to incorporate, what do we consider to be good alt text and what style should we follow when reviewing it and creating it. We had to create specs for our composition and tagging vendors, as well as not just create specs and hand them over, but really engage them in, how are you handling this? How do we get this stuff into you? In what format? What are you doing with it? How do we get it back? As I mentioned, we had to plan for alternate workflows, and not just an author who may not provide alt text, but also we use some composition vendors who do not offer alt text creation and embedding services. So we had to have workflows that would supply that aspect if we had a book going to one of those vendors. So the items in purple are the things that that are sort of in flight right now. All of this other stuff is in production and has been since the beginning of the year, the calendar year roughly. With most of our spring 2025 titles coming out reflecting this level of accessibility. But we are in the midst, probably kind of as I speak, if not tomorrow, of deploying an update to our title management system that will bring into the interface the ability to indicate different types of accessibility, which will ultimately populate the Onyx file that is generated out of our title management system. We are coordinating with our digital asset distribution vendor to make sure that they can capture and hold that metadata, that accessibility metadata, and distribute it with our ebook files out to the marketplace. And then we're just figuring out, like, okay, of that code list, what are we saying in each instance about the book's accessibility, and how do we efficiently insert that into our production workflow? So that's just a really high level overview of kind of how we've tackled this and where we are. And I'll say one more thing because I saw it in one of the questions. We have focused all of our effort on the front list, so on forthcoming books with an eye toward having everything that comes out from June 28th forward meet EAA compliance requirements. That is a reflection of our resources. It's not that we don't know we will need to remediate the backlist, but that's just something we're going to have to tackle later. And I think we'll have opportunities to talk in the discussion about ways to tackle that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that backlist is a big topic of conversation and contention for a lot of folks, so we will absolutely address that in discussion. But right now, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome Rick to go ahead and present. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Excited to give you our perspective on what we're doing to prepare for not only EAA, but the Title II work here in the United States as well. Very similar approaches to both of them. As a vendor who represents the 12,000 or more different publishers that we get content from, we're the face into the public. So how we deal with this is very important. This is me. I've been working on this for a long time. I'm one of the co-founders of Vital Source, but I've been very involved in the industry and helping create some of the standards and helping provide some leadership around some of the standards. I think everyone on this call understands this slide. When you talk about accessibility, you generally talk about these 4 areas. At Vital Source, we talk about a 5th area. We include localization. Language is very key in terms of getting in front of the user in the interface that they're familiar with or that they're using as their native language in their browser or on their operating system. This will become important as we talk about how we're implementing this in a couple of seconds, but we've got users around the world, lots of different countries, lots of different languages. So we localize everything in 37 languages. And this will include the accessibility information as we talk about how we present this in these 37 languages, depending on what the user is configuring and how they're approaching this. We approach accessibility and we approach dealing with the EAA and Title II using what I call the 3 Ds: discovery, disclosure, and debt. In looking at these and in talking about these, debt is sort of the easiest one to understand. This is making sure that our platform and our products are doing the right thing. We design from the beginning, we do testing, we hire outside parties to hold our feet to the fire to make sure we're doing what we say, so that when we deliver our product, our main product is Bookshelf, but across the rest of our platform as well, that we do conform to the standards that are expected by the legislation, in this case, WCAG 2.1, that we do these annual reviews, that we prioritize features. So taking care of debt, taking care of our stuff in-house and making sure our platform works is the first thing that you can understand that we approach. Secondly is that 2nd D, disclosure. We got to tell everybody and provide a way for people to understand what we're doing and what claims that we're making about our platform. The legislation talks about making sure that you can communicate this through an accessibility statement, making sure you can communicate this and provide people access to this. We created a microsite, accessibility.vitalsource.com, and we link to this from all of our applications so that it's easy for a user, whether they're using screen readers or using other technologies or not, that they can find what we're saying and they can get this information about that. And then we keep this updated and keep this current. So another key part of making sure that we disclose and are transparent about where we meet the spec and perhaps where things are in process or in changing, or if we're creating some type of exception to some part of the process. The 3rd D is really what we're all here about, and that's discovery. That's driven by the metadata, impossible to do without the metadata, but it's hard to do it with metadata raw. You need to transform these into understandable concepts, and we need to communicate that out to our institutional and our publishing customers so they can understand the risk that's involved. We have been presenting this using, Gregorio talked about one of the user interface specs that we've all been working on. There was a first version of the spec that came out in 2019. We have been implementing this and displaying this. It really just displayed that raw metadata. And while it was great, and while it exposed this metadata that a lot of people didn't see before, it was hard to understand. If you're an instructor adopting a course or you're a student buying a piece of content, you want to know things before you do that. You want to know, is this going to address the issues that I have? One of the metadata fields I love to pick on because it's hard to understand if you're not immersed in this is what's called access mode sufficient equals textual. It's a mouthful that's really confusing to understand, but it's a very simple idea. Access mode sufficient equals textual basically means, hey, this is part of what's called non-visual reading. And can this piece of content support non-visual reading? In other words, reading without your eyes. Does it support text-to-speech? Does it support Braille displays? Does it support these other types of interactions that I don't need my eyes in order to, quote, read the content that's in here? But communicating this to a user became very difficult. And so very excited in the last few weeks here, the version 2 of the spec has been finalized. It's about to go out with the final draft, and it's available for people to go out and take a look at. And what it does is, instead of the raw metadata, it provides easy to understand phrases that communicate accurately and concisely exactly what is supported or what is not supported. So we are implementing this. And so going back to that store page that I showed earlier, instead of raw metadata, you'll see these phrases. You'll see things like, under ways of reading, oh, all content can be read aloud using read aloud speech or dynamic Braille. Again, that access mode sufficient equals textual, now in an easy to understand phrase that would be localized in one of the 37 languages if I'm using my browser or running an operating system in one of those languages. So here's the user, we're giving them the information about your content as a publisher. We're providing it in an easy way on a store, or in this case, here's inside of our bookshelf application, right on the right-hand side, right as part of the metadata, to be able to see this information, to find this information, and to use it at the point of need where people can get access to this. So this is how we're implementing the data that we receive. We get it through either in the EPUB file, we'll extract it. We'll get it from the Onyx file where we'll extract it, or we provide a way for you to update things in batch if you've got and want to provide some statement or something on your backlist or other large volumes of file or your courseware or things like that. We also provide this access through our APIs, so that if you want to display this on your website and you're a partner of ours, you can either get the raw data, or you can actually get that HTML field that I showed you here on the right-hand side. That whole panel there is an actual HTML snippet we can provide for you to iframe straight into your environment, straight into your website, if you want to display that information as well. We're rolling this out, getting this in our applications across our platform in time for the EAA enforcement deadline. And then rolling out a lot of self-service reporting for institutions and other things around the adoption platforms to get those in place before the Title II deadlines of enforcement that are coming a year from next month. So excited to talk through some of the questions and answers. That gives you an idea of how we're approaching this and the support that we're providing in terms of the accessibility metadata that's out there.
Thank you so much, Frick. At this point, I see that the Q&A is popping off. We've got lots of questions, lots of interest, but there are a few things that I'd love to ask the panelists and touch on before we get into the Q&A. So let's discuss for just a moment. Allison, if we could go back to you for a moment. You talked about the importance of communicating with your vendors. Can you talk a little bit more about nurturing that relationship and making sure that everyone's on the same page there, and what kind of requirements and things that you have for each other?
Sure. And I'll start by observing that choices that we have made about outsourcing and vendors up to this point have served us very well in tackling this. And specifically, I mean, one, we don't do this in-house, and we haven't ever since I've been here. So we had vendors to turn to with established relationships that are constantly nurtured already and are trusting relationships. Two, we don't keep a large stable of vendors. So that minimized the number of vendors that we needed to have these conversations with and make arrangements with and coordinate workflows with. But I really fundamentally, I don't think this is in any way different than if you work with an outside compositor, than what you already do. You know, you need to tell them what they can expect from you, or you need to find out from them how you need to prepare the materials. You need to tell them how you expect them to handle what they're getting and what to do with it, and what you expect delivered. So again, that comes down to, how do we need to prep? How do we need to package up the alt text for them? Or how do we need to indicate the language shifts to them? And how do we tell them what languages are present to look for? For alt text, it has to do with, you know, how long do we expect it to be? For instance, our house style guide on alt text says avoid use of the phrase an image of or a picture of. So, just the kind of things that you would tell them about design, or that you would tell a copy editor about anything else your house style governs. One thing that is different, I guess, about this, and I don't know if it's because this is about accessibility or if it's the moment in time, but this has come on when AI, large language models and generative AI is in play and an option. And so I think a really important conversation to have with your vendor is, are they using AI if they're generating alt text for you? If so, are you okay with that? If you are okay with it, are they securing your intellectual property? Meaning, are they using a closed system to generate it? And then what kind of SLAs do they have on the output and the quality? What kind of checking, human intervention and checking are they doing? You want to be sure you know as much as possible about that if AI is in the mix.
I'd love to extend the AI topic to our other panelists, Rick and Gregorio. What thoughts do you have on the ethical use of AI for alt text and other tools and workflows to help with EAA compliance?
We had running quite a lot of research on using AI for accessibility, for making ebooks more accessible. We started with using AI for creating alt text in 2018, far before the generative AI wave. What we have seen is that for sure this tool can help in working in making more cheaper and faster the production of alt text, but there is still need, and we think there will be always need quality assurance check on the AI produced alt text, because the quality and I mean the trust of what is produced have to be really careful managed by publishers.
I honed in on the word ethical in the question, and to me that just means disclosure. If you're going to do this, you should somewhere in your metadata, and there's a field in there for essentially additional information. You should disclose this and make sure that people know that this was generated by alt text in case there are issues.
Great, thank you. I'd like to pivot a little bit. It's really helpful to have this experience that you're sharing, but for publishers that are coming to this just now, that are just discovering about this or just able to develop resources to it, where do they start?
All right, so I have few suggestions for that. I had some slides, but yeah, just super fast. So first thing, we suggest to start with taking accessibility as a strategic resource. So identify an accessibility manager within your organization, analyzing your current state, acquiring the necessary skills, defining a roadmap for accessibility. As I mentioned, is not a switch, it's not something that you start and you are fully accessible, and align the different areas of the company to accessibility, from the production to the help desk, client service, customer service part of your organization, and then communicating your accessibility policies, as Rick mentioned. And for new publications, we suggest to map your internal and external workflows, and so to adapt the production processes and to make the ebooks accessible and train your personnel, as Alison mentioned. They did. It's possible both on XML workflows, workflows based on InDesign. We have seen it adopted in many different organizations. While for the backlist conversion, I don't know if we want to dig into this topic now or leave it.
We can dig into backlists. It's something
okay.
a lot of people are asking about, and I have it in my notes to ask about as well. So why don't we go ahead?
Yeah, so in the EAA law, there is not a concept of new books, new ebooks, and backlist, because ebooks are intended as services, and so they should be accessible from the date of the 28th. This is important to mention. Nevertheless, we know how difficult it is to manage the backlist conversion and remediation. So we suggest, as Alison mentioned, to define a strategy. Define a strategy, and we think that the strategy should start on analyzing your catalog to define which titles should be made accessible. So sort the titles according to their characteristics. Maybe you have a lot of titles without images, and that is much simpler. And then establish a remediation plane, starting with the best-selling or adopted titles if you are an academic or educational publisher. And for eventually evaluate and document any disproportionate burden, because in the European Accessibility Act, there are 3 exemptions that can be claimed by publishers, by every company. One is micro enterprise, which means less than 2 million euros turnover and less than 10 full-time employees. The second one is the disproportionate burden, means it's too expensive to make the ebook accessible, comparing the benefits of the end users, which is quite tricky because evaluating the benefits of end users is not that simple. And the third one is fundamental alteration. And fundamental alteration means I have to completely refactor, completely reorganize my publication to make it accessible. And we think that may be something related to comics or highly graphical content that will be really, really difficult to make accessible.
Alison, you mentioned that a lot of your content is also highly graphic, and I've seen some notes about people that are doing coffee table books and like very image heavy books. What advice do you have for addressing the backlist question for those kinds of content?
So we've talked about this sort of at a hypothetical level for the backlist, and you know, what we have been doing is creating fixed layout EPUBs, which don't meet the accessibility requirements, but it also seems, you know, to do something different depending on the book itself could. So for instance, we publish concrete poetry, you know, where the shape of the poem conveys the meaning. So these are all questions that we're wrestling with. And so we have actually thought about, you know, yes, it's an EPUB. Yes, we would create alt text for what is essentially the page image that would explain what the creator is trying to get across. But those are just books I don't think we can fundamentally make fully accessible.
With that perspective. Before we open it up to the Q&A, I have one last question that I'd like to ask the panelists, and that would be around penalties. For folks that are, again, coming to this or have that sense of disproportionate burden, what are the penalties for non-compliance if you don't qualify for an exemption?
One of the interesting differentiations of the EAA versus what's happening in the States here with Title II is enforcement is country by country in the EAA. And so penalties will be determined country by country. There's no unifying approach to it all. So it's a little bit different than what's happening here in the US with Title II, which is sort of at the federal level. And so like, this is where I'm not a lawyer hat goes on, but what my lawyers have told me is that like any new law, any new legislation, we're not going to know the details until there's case law, until things have gone to trial. Our approach and what we want to do for our partners is should those things happen where case law is established, we want to be the ones that somebody points to and says, this is how you should do it, rather than be the ones that say, why didn't you do this? And so we're trying to go above and beyond what even may be implied, just to make sure we're doing everything we can to support enforcements and non-compliance there.
Yeah, if I can jump in as a European I mean, this is maybe a little bit it's a little bit different approach from the States to the EU when it comes to these big new laws, like it was for the privacy and the GDPR. You may heard about it. It started 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and the whole industry, digital industry, moved to a step forward on the management of privacy. But at the end, the enforcement was not that strict. But the idea to move the whole industry a step forward is what moves the European Commission. So we think it will be similar for accessibility. We do not foresee a lot of enforcements, also because there is a system for claims. You start claiming the publisher, then you can claim the country organization for accessibility that can ask the publisher to fix the thing. So there is a different scale of claims. At the end, you may get a fine, but I think it will be quite difficult to get at that level. So the idea is more on elevate the average accessibility of the contents available.
Thank you. Well, let's go ahead and pivot to the Q&A. We've got a robust set of questions and more coming in, so let me go ahead and get that started. We have a question from Karen who wants to pivot back to Allison. We've learned that language tagging is a critical piece to qualify an ebook as accessible, but we can't get a clear answer on whether that only applies to full sentences, blocks of text, or if any single word in another language needs to be tagged. Can you advise on this?
I can't advise from a legal perspective at all. Like several things I've said, our approach to this is, I guess our general methodology has been to start with, can we achieve the maximum? Start with a maximal effort for maximal effect. And then we just hit the reality of constraints. And foreign language is one of these, where it has proven just much more labor intensive and time intensive than we can afford. And when I say afford, I mean both to pay freelancers to do it at scale, and the time that it takes, it adds to the book project. So whereas we started where we were going to tag basically every instance, even a single word, we are contemplating kind of moving back to a looser standard and maybe defining, some, phrases above 5 words, or, we don't have that nailed down yet, but something along those lines.
And I was going to add that Livia and Jessica on the Duke University staff have added some comments later in the chat that kind of directly address this. I'll push those out so that people can see them.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I am thrilled that many members of the Duke University Press copy editing, design, and production team are here and can report on the on-the-ground view of what's actually going on. But yeah, I mean, so that approach kind of applies. I think there was a question about, do we think it'll be okay not to have the PDFs accessible? I don't know, but we read the EAA to say that an accessible format needs to be available. And so just in terms of compliance, we can point to our EPUB 3 and show that it's available. Now, in terms of, is that what we as publishers who want all of our content to be as accessible as possible in whatever format someone in the world may encounter it? No, that's not enough, but our resources are constrained in such a way that that's just going to have to be a secondary priority.
From Kathy, in the same vein, do you ever have situations where your copy editors can't identify the languages used?
Go ahead, Gregory.
No, just to say that on this specific topic on language tagging, which is a tricky thing, we know, AI can help. Maybe not the generative AI. We developed things, we developed tools that can help to speed up this work that can be semi-automated at a good level. So it's not only, manual work, but it's something that can be semi-automated from our point of view.
So I think that's a really good point. And we've done a little bit of just playing around. We don't have in-house developers to build an app to embed in our copy editing, but we have played around in constrained ways to see what, say, Gemini can identify. It does really well with major European languages, major Asian languages. We publish a lot of anthropology that deals with a lot of indigenous languages, or even not even indigenous, but more obscure. So to Kathy's question, Kathy, I believe our process would entail the project editors kind of assessing the manuscript, and if they find a language that isn't, that is in the book that the author hasn't called out, that is relatively obscure or not spoken by a lot of people, a lot of times our authors will let us know that already, and we'll call that out to the project editors. So I don't know if we have specifically in the 6 months that we've had this in place encountered that. Yeah. Jessica Ryan notes that asking authors to give us the languages helps. So at least asking them to declare what languages will we find in your book.
We have a question from Ali, who is asking, what's the best way to display that accessibility info on the website selling the books? Do you have any resources that you can direct folks to kind of provide some clarity on how people are handling this and displaying this on a per product basis?
Maybe this is on Rick. I think that, yeah, on.
I was typing another answer to the Q&A and I missed the question. I'm sorry.
Not a problem. That question's from Ali. What's the best way to display accessibility information on websites that sell books? And are there any sites that you can direct me to show others how others are handling this on a per product basis?
I saw earlier Gregorio put a link to the standard that's just getting finalized. That's the best way, in my opinion. That's the one that we're adopting. That's the one that we're pushing. It provides it in those easy to understand phrases, provides a good example layout. We will be an example. Fondazione will have some examples for how they're organizing it, but it fundamentally describes in there at least the pieces to be used and how to display them.
Related to codes, this is also probably a question for Rick. Nora has asked, how are you identifying which codes to implement into your title management from the code list?
Essentially, we're following the specifications that come to us by saying code list, assuming you mean Onyx. Onyx has a very good write-up on the different accessibility code lists that provide accessibility support. If you have data in any one of those code lists, we're going to pull it in. We're going to use the transformations in that spec and provide the resulting phrases and make them available. So give it to us where it makes sense and we will use it per the spec.
Also relating to Onyx, Kathy asks, regarding Onyx code list 196, is anyone using the exceptions? So EAA exception 1, 2, and 3 for the micro enterprises, disproportionate burden, and fundamental alteration.
So those codes were added to the code list on requests of the Federation of European Publishers. And these codes are there for helping publishers to declare an exception to a specific for a specific title. In the guidelines for displaying accessibility metadata, we also manage those codes, and we suggest to display quite a generic sentence telling that this specific title claim an exemption in some jurisdictions. Nevertheless, even if telling the end user of a specific exemption may not be that important, we think that within the supply chain, so for aggregators, distributors, vendors like Vital Source, knowing that a title is not accessible for a specific exemption is important. So we suggest to use those codes in your Onyx feed if you claim something, but then you need to have the proof for your claims.
And Gregorio, if you could just outline one more time and summarize what are those 3 exemptions?
Yeah, so first one is micro enterprise, and I've put in the chat before what it is intended as a micro enterprise. It means an enterprise which employs fewer than 10 persons and which has an annual turnover not exceeding 2 million euros or an annual balance sheet total not exceeding 2 million euros. So micro enterprise. Second is fundamental alteration. There is an ongoing work in the Federation of European Publishers to define common guidelines in Europe for publishers to calculate these disproportionate burdens. So the cost for making a specific ebook accessible, comparing the benefits of the end users. And the third one is the fundamental alteration, meaning you have to completely change your content to make it accessible.
Thank
These
you.
are for simplify. Again, not a law here.
Of course. Krista asks, how do publishers need to document exceptions? What needs to be documented? How is it sent? Who receives it? If you are going to claim an exemption as a publisher, how do you do your due diligence to make sure that you're covered? And again, not legal advice.
Yeah. It depends. I mean, for micro enterprise, it's quite simple, isn't it? I mean, you have your balance sheet, you have your documents. For the fundamental alteration and for the disproportionate burden, one thing that is written in the law is that is not one claim and it's okay for ever and ever, but you have to recheck your claims periodically. There is no set a period, but periodically. Different states are defining different ways to make those claims. France is one of the most advanced right now, but we understand and the Europe is understanding as well that for publishers outside Europe is different to claim, to send these claims to all the 27 countries in Europe. So right now there is no a common way for making those claims, and all the proofs and the way to make the calculations is on the publisher's side. But we think something may come in the next months.
I would just add in, if you're going to make one of those claims, communicate it somewhere in the metadata. The worst thing would be for someone to go to a retail site, select your piece of content, and see nothing. You want to communicate something so that we at least show that.
And Onyx has the fields for it.
Yep.
An anonymous attendee has asked if you can claim multiple exemptions at the same time, or should you only file one?
Yeah. Potentially, yes. There is no limit and constraint in the metadata.
So I'll just jump in and say that we don't plan to claim any exemptions other than maybe, this fundamentally can't be made accessible for some of those books in our backlist or potentially in our front list. We don't, we're too big to claim micro enterprise but I think instead what we will do is try to document everything as well as we can, communicate that as clearly and transparently as we can, like what is and isn't accessible and why it may not be. And then if contacted about a specific title, to share that transparently and show that we're doing our due diligence to do it. And again, that kind of comes from what Gregorio was suggesting, which is that this may play out in a way similar to how GDPR played out. Which is that we don't expect the first thing to happen is that somebody knocks on our door, levying a $100,000 fine. We expect one to be kind of low on the on the list the list of targets, and two, the first contact to be, I'm finding this inaccessible. Can you get me an accessible version? And then we have a chance to remediate that on a case-by-case basis, or explain, if it's about a swath of books, explain, no, it's not now, but here is our plan for when it will be.
For Allison and for Rick, can you talk a little bit about the financial aspects of this endeavor? How are publishers considering and weighing the costs? Is there a financial modeling approach, a developed budget threshold? How do publishers prioritize titles beyond the front list? I've heard from some folks, ask, should we be prioritizing, our best sellers in the backlist? Should we be doing it by date? What are recommended approaches here?
I can tell you what we're observing as we're getting content in from our, as I mentioned before, multiple thousands of publishers. It's exactly the approach that we're seeing. What's selling in the market, what's moving in the market's getting addressed first. What's in a format that's easier to address, like EPUB, is getting addressed second. And generally, if it's outside of one of those two things, it's how do we move it to one of those two things? It's usually the third priority. But that's sort of our observations of what we're seeing happening in the market.
So our goal is that by the time we get to June 28th and EAA, that we have a documented plan for how we're going to tackle the backlist. And again, this is so if we are contacted about a backlist book that is not yet fully accessible, we can share that plan. Yeah. Roughly, that plan will basically be triaged by bestsellers, what is most important that we have available in the EU market. But then that's a title by title thing, but also in parallel, I would imagine that we're going to kind of group these into seasons or years and sort of work our way backwards. And what we'll probably, ideally, what we would do is say, there is going to be this much budget allocated every year to remediate the backlist. And then slot in whole season's worth or whole year's worth based on that budget availability. So just try to operationalize it in that way and make steady progress over several years, probably, unless we got a windfall and a really good conversion deal.
I can share a couple of pieces of data of what we've observed in the marketplace. We're academic, educational focused, so to semester focused. This last semester that ended in December, I mean, we move tens of millions of titles a year into the marketplace for different publishers, different institutions. Of what we moved into the marketplace this last semester, it's now less than 20% of that is PDF. More than 80% of that is EPUB, in terms of, and that's continuing to slide down. Of those EPUBs that we moved into the marketplace, more than 65% of those had accessibility metadata, and that's continuing to ramp up, sharply ramp up. And so the market's moving.
Again, talking a little bit deeper on exemptions. If a micro enterprise title is distributed by a larger company or vendor, is the micro enterprise still responsible, or does it scale up with those requirements?
Hashtag as always, but there has been quite an important discussion at European level to define the responsibilities. And so on the production, the responsibility is quite clear. So for making the ebook accessible and create the accessibility metadata, that is responsibility of the publisher. So the publisher can claim the micro enterprise. The micro enterprise is, I mean, you can claim that even if the European Commission suggests invite micro enterprise to make their ebooks accessible, for sure. So that's why we have these exemptions. So it's not about the distributor or aggregator, it's about the actual publisher.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are about at time. We still have some questions left in the Q&A, so I'll make sure that those reach our panelists and are distributed. As a reminder to folks, we'll distribute those answers. We'll distribute a recording of the webinar. Thank you so much to the panelists for all of your time. I do want to take just a moment to say that on June 17th, we have another accessibility metadata webinar. This one is going to be on the ADA Title II update and what you need to know. So a nice opportunity to compare and contrast those two requirements and learn what other things you can do to get your metadata going. I also do want to note that our accessibility metadata working group is open to both BISG members and non-members, and we're looking for volunteers to come in and help us amplify and educate the industry around these things. So I'll drop the link to that webinar in the chat, but thank you everyone so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure hearing your perspectives here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So much.